Alright, so I'm going to respond to some comments again, because there have been a couple good ones. This is really difficult to navigate. So it seems like a lot of these comments have turned into nonsense, nonsense trolling. But I'm not above a bit of nonsense. One of them actually really made me laugh. Let's see if I can find it here. It's something about the shelf structure. Something about the shelf structure. Let me find it here. I'm not sure if I'm going to find it now. It's like, you had to be there. But could it be, the question is, be you not there? That is the question. Namaste. I can't find it, so right. So see pretty much all I see is authenticity in its various different expressions and its various different forms. Be it intentional or not, be it conscious authenticity or not. The problem with talking about this, and the problem with that can pop up, and it's popped up a number of times now, is that when someone interacts with me through whatever medium here, and then if they go on to talk about something like post-awakening or their experience post-awakening, then I would just assume, and this may be a lack of skill on my part potentially, but I'll just assume that there is some degree of clarity there. There is some degree of disidentification from this shelf structure, and then I'll go ahead and point, as usual, at, and the only thing I can really point at directly is the seeming obstruction. But when in someone's experience that obstruction, that position, that process really feels like that's me, that's what I am, then when I go ahead and directly point at that, it can feel like I'm pointing at you. It can feel threatening. Like, a few things can happen. One, it doesn't make any sense. Two, it can be unsettling. It can be come across as threatening. It can be destabilizing or disorienting, and that leads to that triggers a reaction, because this awakening, non-dual awakening thing is potentially the most triggering thing there is. And from that ID position, the perceived source of that trigger is always only going to be seen as an object of attention separate from that position, an object of attention out there. So the authenticity thing, I think it's really important to be able to authentically look at your yourself, look at the self. And yeah, the whole thing's pretty much an inside the job. But it can get, if you this isn't something really to get into lightly. It can really mess with your head. It can really destabilize you, or like I made a video about this before, this non-dual awakening thing, if taken on by the mind, can do some damage psychologically. It's possible. It's possible, but so it's really easy for me to take things as authentic, or take things as what could be potentially an authentic exploration, and it can be really easy for me to, and it's not me doing it obviously, but it can really be easy for this pointing to be destabilizing. It can be very, very triggering. But so many comments from, it looks like Daniel has become a resident troll. He's just here to annoy you and see if you get triggered or not. That's actually perfect, isn't it? That's perfect. Right. Guys, I'm not doing very well here. Okay. Okay. So, one party relay. Says, to answer your question, that yes, it resonates. The perspective is not all stable in me, though. So this year goes to different people who are sharing their experience of freedom, like yourself, for different flavored pointers to pull me back into this perspective. I like your videos because they're very direct, and that approach is sometimes the most helpful. I like Muji because he has a certain warmth and humour, and religious or spiritual perspective. And I like Rupert Spira because he's analytical. So the person I go to for reminders depends upon how much I'm currently being taught by my identity. Caught by my identity. And what its current interests are. Oh. I really struggle to summon the perspective in my own. So I'm really grateful that you guys are creating these videos as a resource for those who haven't yet stabilized in the experience. Thank you. So the stability that you're talking about is it. I would say it never really stabilizes, because what makes it seem like there is a lack of stability in this, or this back and forth, half in, half out experience, is a belief thought. The belief thought that says that, for example, I'm not awake, or this experience is not already perfect. This experience is not already nothing but this awakeness or enlightenment. So it's an added to that makes it seem like that is but nothing's really being added. Nothing real is really being added. It's something that comes after the fact. Through that lens of thought labeling this as unstable, or this thought as unenlightened, or this behaviour as meaning that this isn't already inherently perfect as it is what generates the illusion of the instability of this awakening that we never really ever get as a thing that's owned by me as my experience. So the stability, if you could call it that, is inherent in experience, but that inherent stability in experience is paradoxically coupled with, in a seemingly impossible way, a constant ever-changing flux of instability or groundlessness or no position to take separate from this experience to label it as either stable or not stable. So in that, it just becomes really simple and realise that we're telling ourselves that this experience is this for me, or this experience is that for me, is simply one thought that appears right now. And I always say this because it brings it all back to this. No matter what this is, it's perfect. No matter what this is, it is it. It is it inherently. So it seems like we get carried away into a thought narrative, and it's an automatic, habitual, seeming happening that just almost comes through the back door and takes away thisness, this isness feeling, this just here-ness that we associate in that thought as clarity. But that itself is also clarity. It just has this kind of dream-like, unconscious kind of feeling to it, but that's not actually happening. What makes it seem like, say you get lost in thought and you come out and you're like, oh, I was lost in thought. That noticing that you were lost in thought and saying, oh, I was lost in, that's another thought. That's another thought. What comes, maybe you could say that when that thought subsides, then this presence is here, but it's not here in the absence of the thought. The thought is made of it. So all of it's it. It meaning enlightenment. So it gets very, very simple. You can use this way of talking as like a conduit, it seems. But that only happens because the attention is brought to what's being pointed to, let's say consciously. It seems like that. But you can do that all the time. Regardless if you're using a pointing or not. And eventually it starts doing itself without the need for a person doing in the centre of it. But yeah, that was a good comment. So J Mac says, hi David, I wanted to ask you another question in your experience. So Jay asked, it mentioned something about another one noticing this, I'm never going to be able to remember this. Noticing a phantom, he called it a phantom self. So I think, J Mac, you were describing that you recognise this function, this pattern in yourself, and then you started noticing it everywhere, and went on to describe that as you look for it, so I'll paraphrase this into my own words and my own experience, that as you look for it, it becomes more elusive, it seems to become more evasive, and you never find it. But it still continues. I'm personifying it here. It still continues to insist that it's there. Strangely enough, the further into this we go, we don't see that as necessarily an entity, but a function that's common across people. And you explained in the last comment something about it being repetitive, maybe. It moves the same, it talks the same, it's generic, this selfing mechanism is generic, but it feels very special from that position. It feels very special, but from a more subtle position, it's seen that it's just an automatic process with no inherent autonomy, like an imitation of life, like a I'm making it sound like a thing. It's not a thing. Like an imitation. How would you describe it? Like an imitation of life that happens to be made entirely of life, made entirely of awakeness. But it's like it lacks its own autonomy, although from that position it feels like it's autonomous. It lacks its own individuality, although from that position it feels like an individual. It's almost unconscious, and it's predictable. You can predict it. So that's the repetitive and automatic nature of thoughts, as built up as a habit that just runs automatically without free will or autonomy. But you do start noticing it everywhere. Eventually that noticing is revealed, let's say, to be another position. But that whole let's say the lesson that is to be learned from that almost isn't accessible when you're looking from that position, when you're identified with that position. And I could describe the lesson for me in that the more this automatic pattern played out, the less and less believable it became, the less and less real it seemed, to the point where it clearly wasn't. But what was behind that, let's say, what was more real than that, became infinitely more interesting, infinitely more fascinating than the function of it. Back to this comment. So I have this really interesting experience after all these years of self-inquiry, which is that I can look up at the worst in the world, people I should hate, and events that should terrify me, and it all registers like a movie. What I mean is the emotional response is like I'm watching a movie. It just doesn't register as being real. And the same sort of experience relates to how I see myself. Like this thing that I call me is like a character in this movie, and the experience is just that it's not really real. It feels very real and solid, like matter, but psychologically none of it registers as really real. Just curious if you have something like that going on. So in an earlier set of videos I described the initial recognition as being an expansion out of self into our position into more subtle version of self, or a more subtle position. It becomes a much more subtle, to the point where I described it as a kind of form of disassociation from experience, like a step back out of experience, into a more subtle position that isn't as reactive, isn't as invested in the story or in the thought. This was my experience with it. The experience becomes more vast. The experience becomes more vast, but at the same time more contained. So I think this is similar to what you're talking about when you describe it like a movie. There's a separation from it. There's a degree of space separate from it that allows this disidentification from the content of experience. In my experience, let's say it starts to get hard to talk about, but that position, there's almost like a move back into experience. So that position separate from the experience, that subtle position, then is found not to be separate from the experience itself. So then there's a complete immersion in the experience. And that's when it starts to get a bit frightening, and I experienced a lot of this Dark Night of the Soul stuff, because that very subtle, expansive position then collapsed. And then it was very clear that this is all there is. Because in that there was a very subtle suggestion that this is not real, this isn't real, so there has to be something else that's more real, that is very subtly being imagined. It's a very nice place to be, but then when you look for that subtle suggestion of what is more real than this, or what is lurking behind this, or what is beyond this, or what is lurking in the depths of whatever this experience is that's not it. I can't remember what I said before. You don't find that. And then when that becomes clear, there's a full-on immersion in this immediate sensory experience as something that cannot be labelled real or unreal, because that position separate from it that can relate to it in a very subtle way just isn't present anymore. So then it just becomes impossible to talk about. This is the non-dual recognition that I talk about. This is when the experience becomes much more fascinating than any subtle position that can relate to it from any perceived or suggested distance or separation. And in and as this experience, everything becomes the way it is, entirely perfectly, without any resistance to it. And in that is liberation, and that is freedom. Because there's nothing that it's clear there's nothing that needed to be liberated. It's clear that this is purely non-dual, this is purely not two, this is all there is. There's not something after, before, behind or in front. It's a very, very subtle position. But for this we need to fully go into the sensory experience and stay there to the extent that we forget the experiencer altogether. That one that relates to experience is in the centre of it. These physical barriers then break down, and physicality then becomes not as a separate unit, but as the entirety of experience, not separate from it. So nothing can be found in it other than the appearance itself. So it's merely always only the appearance, including inexclusive of anything, including thoughts, including disgust, including pain, including emotion. And it's seen that everything is the way it is because that's the way it is, and that's it. That's not a belief. It's very different. It's not a belief. It's just the way it is. Just this. You hear people say just this all the time. I'd say the gateway to this, in my experience, is to see, for example, I've done a load of videos on this, is once the mind's out of the road, once the suggested reality of the mind-made self has been thoroughly disidentified from, now, immediately, when that's not pulling attention away from this experience continuously through habit, then you see, and say for example in this visual experience, this visual appearance, can there be found anything separate from that here that is me if I actually look? This is when it can get scary. This is when you stop being able to describe it or explain it. You stop being able to relate to your experience as an experiencer altogether. This is when it becomes so paradoxical that it stops making sense altogether. And this is where the entire spiritual journey it can be let go of completely. And the perfection, the immersion, the beauty, the existence itself, without a position to call it existence, is experienced as, some people just call it transcendent love or transcendent wisdom or liberation. Because it's seen that there was no one there in the first place to be liberated. There was no position here separate from anything else. All was one. All was actually one. And all the suggestions about, very subtle suggestions that this is not a non-dual singularity, this is not unity, this is not freedom already, go out the window. And at a certain point, even if those thoughts and stuff do come back, it's always seen as that. Anything experience is always seen as that, but not seen from any position. So the riddles continue. Alright, let's see. I think that's it. See if there's any more here. No, I think we're good. Then it never stops being immense. It never stops being beautiful. It never stops being fascinating. It never stops capturing effortlessly the attention of itself. At a certain point, the universe just starts universing itself, and there's no clinging anymore, there's no striving anymore, it's all just perfection. And that doesn't mean that there can't be, on the relative timeline, improvements to the affairs of the world, but it all has to come from this. It all has to come from clarity. Because any positions, even subtle, always resist or oppose other positions. When there's no position or all positions, when there's no separation but all unity, then the inherent harmony will manifest through this expression, through this appearance, effortlessly. And we can all see, we all know what happens in the absence of this clarity, what happens in the absence of this wisdom. But even that is made of it. Even that is wisdom itself. Even that is, some people call it grace. It's all grace. It's all wisdom. It's all this, no matter what.